Senator from North Dakota.
Mr. President, in about an hour, we are going to vote on a package that was sent this body by the House of Representatives. Let me first comment on the context within which we consider this legislation. I think it's very important to remind our colleagues and remind citizens across the country who are perhaps watching and listening that our country is borrowing more than 40 cents of every dollar that we spend. That is unsustainable. It cannot be continued for long. Mr. President, I think all of us know that the circumstance that we are in is extraordinarily serious. Here's what the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff told us just a year ago. Our national debt is our biggest national security threat. Mr. President, I believe that that's the case. Our gross debt now is approaching 100% of the gross domestic product of the United States. We've not seen a debt that high since after World War II. Mr. President, it is extraordinarily important that we take on this debt threat. It is extraordinarily important for our country's future economic well-being that we change course. But Mr. President, the legislation that has been sent to us by the House is one of the most ill-considered, ill-conceived, internally inconsistent pieces of legislation that I have seen in my 25 years here in the United States Senate. It has all the earmarks of something that was hastily thrown together, really pasted together. And this legislation includes an amendment to the Constitution of the United States. Mr. President, we are better than this. The Congress is better than this. Certainly the country is better than this. Let me just be brief. The fundamental problems with the balanced budget amendment are as follows. One, it restricts the ability to respond to economic downturns, having all the potential to make an economic downturn even more serious. It uses Social Security funds to calculate balance and subjects that important program to the same cuts as other federal spending, even though it is funded separately. Mr. President, it shifts the ultimate decisions on budgeting in this country to unelected judges and unaccountable judges. Finally, it provides for a state ratification process that could take years to complete. We need a long-term debt resolution now, not in the sweet by and by. Mr. President, the proposal before us has all of the potential to turn a recession into a depression. Why do I say that? Well, because, Mr. President, it would prevent Congress from taking urgent action to provide lift to the economy in the midst of a severe economic downturn. Here's what Norman Ornstein, a distinguished scholar at the American Enterprise Institute, said about it. Few ideas are more seductive on the surface and more destructive in reality than a balanced budget amendment to the Constitution. Here's why. Nearly all of our states have balanced budget requirements. That means when the economy slows, states are forced to raise taxes or slash spending at just the wrong time, providing a fiscal drag when what is needed is counter-cyclical policy to stimulate the economy. In fact, the fiscal drag from the states in 2009 and 2010 was barely countered by the federal stimulus plan. That meant the federal stimulus provided was nowhere near what was needed, but far better than doing nothing. Now imagine that scenario with a federal drag instead. Mr. President, the Washington Post editorialized, worse yet, the latest version of the balanced budget amendment would impose an absolute cap on spending as a share of the economy. It would prevent federal expenditures from exceeding 18% of the gross domestic product in any year. Most unfortunately, the amendment lacks a clause letting the government exceed that limit to strengthen a struggling economy. Mr. President, that has all of the potential to turn a recession into a depression. Two of this country's most distinguished economists, Alan Blinder, former vice chairman of the Federal Reserve, and Mark Zandi, former consultant advisor to Senator McCain in his presidential campaign, evaluated the government response to the last downturn. Their conclusion, absent that federal response, we would have had Great Depression 2.0. Mr. President, the legislation before us would have prevented that federal response. They call this legislation Cut, Cap, and Balance. They misnamed it. They should have called it Cut, Cap, and Kill Medicare, because that's precisely what it would do. Now, Mr. President, why do I say that? Because when I referred earlier to the internal inconsistency of this legislation, this is what I was referring to. They have two different spending caps in the legislation before us. In one part of the legislation, they say the spending cap would take spending from 24.1% of GDP to 19.9%. That's in one part of the bill before us. In another part of the bill, the constitutional amendment, they say the spending cap would be 18% of GDP. So, I don't know who cooked this up, but you think they'd have at least gotten on the same page as to what is the limitation on spending. What does it mean if you have a balanced budget amendment with a cap of 18% of GDP? Well, Mr. President, here's what it means. And by the way, the constitutional provision would certainly trump the conflicting provision that's in this legislation. So the cap would not be 19% of GDP. The cap would be 19.9. It would be 18% of GDP. What would that mean? Well, this line, this dotted black line, is 18% of GDP. If you fund just Social Security, defense, and other non-health spending, and interest on the debt, you're at 18% of GDP. There's not a dime left for Medicare. There's not a dime left for Medicaid. Is that really what they intended? It must be, because that's what it says. So Medicare is finished. Medicaid is finished. Anybody that votes for this ought to understand what they're voting to do. Mr. President, here is a former top economic advisor to President Reagan. Here's what he said about the amendment that is before us. In short, this is quite possibly the stupidest constitutional amendment I think I have ever seen. It looks like it was drafted by a couple of interns on the back of a napkin. Every senator co-sponsoring this legislation should be ashamed of themselves. Mr. President, that's a former top economic advisor to Ronald Reagan. I've been here 25 years. I don't think I have ever seen a piece of legislation more unprofessionally constructed than the legislation before us. But those aren't the only problems. When they said they titled this Cut, Cap, and Balance, they could have also called it Preserve, Protect, and Defend Tax Havens and Tax Shelters, because that's the other consequence of this legislation. Why do I say that? Because it would take a two-thirds vote to increase revenue. Two-thirds vote. That means attempts to shut down these offshore tax havens, these abusive tax shelters, because they'd raise revenue, would take a two-thirds vote. Now, what does that mean? Well, here's a little building down the Cayman Islands I've talked about many times. Little 5-story building, claims to be home to 18,857 companies. They all claim they're doing business out of this little building. I've said this is the most efficient building in the world. Quite remarkable. 18,857 companies are doing the business out of this little 5-story building. And I'm told there are not many people coming and going from this building during the day. Are 18,000 companies really doing their business? They call this headquarters. Is that really their headquarters? We all know it's not their headquarters. We all know what's going on. It's not business, it's monkey business. What they're doing down there is avoiding the taxes that all the rest of us pay. And this amendment would protect this scheme. You want to protect this scheme? Vote for this amendment. Mr. President, how big is this scheme? Well, here's what our own Permanent Subcommittee on Investigations has told us. Experts have estimated the total loss to the Treasury from offshore tax evasion alone approaches $100 billion a year, including $40 to $70 billion from individuals, another $30 billion from corporations engaging in offshore tax evasion. Abusive tax shelters add tens of billions of dollars more. Mr. President, you want to lock in these abuses? You prefer to pay more in taxes yourself so that people can engage in these scams? Vote for this amendment. Vote for the legislation that's before us. Vote for what is on the floor, because you'll protect them forevermore. Mr. President, I end as I began. This is perhaps the most ill-conceived, ill-considered, internally inconsistent legislation that I have ever seen in my 25 years in the United States Senate. I hope my colleagues have the wisdom to vote no. I thank the chair and yield the floor.